April 20, 1945. A secure telephone line crackles in the headquarters of Germany's 12th Army. General Walter Wenk lifts the receiver. The voice on the other end is unmistakable, Adolf Hitler, calling from his bunker beneath burning Berlin. The order is direct. Attack toward the capital with every man, every tank, every gun. Break through Soviet encirclement. Save the Reich. Wenk has 24 hours to comply. Refusal means execution for treason. But Wenk holds intelligence reports Hitler will never see. Reports showing that complying means sacrificing 200,000 men for a city already lost. He faces the choice that will define his life: obey a dead ideology, or save the living. What he decides will rescue 250,000 lives and rewrite the meaning of duty itself. 5 weeks earlier, the Yalta Conference sealed Germany's fate. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill divided Europe with red lines on maps. Soviet occupation zones. American occupation zones. The agreement was clear: German forces surrender to whoever occupies their territory. What the Allied planners didn't anticipate was that this administrative decision would create the largest calculated flight in military history. Because by April 1945, every German soldier with access to intelligence understood a brutal statistical reality. Surrender to American forces, 96.4% survival rate. Surrender to Soviet forces, 35% survival rate. Those numbers weren't propaganda. They were projections based on intercepted Soviet communications and reports from German intelligence networks still operating in occupied territories. The math was simple. The implications were existential. The strategic situation was beyond recovery. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front were crushing the last organized German resistance with overwhelming superiority. 20 Soviet divisions for every German division still combat effective. The Soviet advance covered 30 kilometers daily. German refugee columns managed 10 on good days. Behind the advancing Red Army, 8 million German civilians fleeing westward from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. In front, the Elbe River, where American forces had halted according to agreements made with their Soviet allies. Between these forces, a shrinking corridor of German-held territory measuring barely 200 kilometers at its widest point. Every hour, that corridor narrowed. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly desperate picture. German forces weren't just retreating anymore. They were abandoning defensive positions without orders, destroying their own equipment when it slowed movement, and fighting through SS blocking detachments trying to stop them. The Wehrmacht, once Europe's most disciplined fighting force, was dissolving into a human flood flowing toward one objective: American lines on the western bank of the Elbe River. The calculation driving this mass movement was more fundamental than military strategy. It was the statistical certainty of death in Soviet captivity versus survival in American hands. The evidence was overwhelming. German military intelligence had compiled detailed reports throughout early 1945. In East Prussia, an estimated 300,000 civilians died during the Soviet advance from combat, exposure, revenge killings, and systematic assault. Applied to the military forces and civilians now trapped between the Elbe and the advancing Red Army, these casualty ratios suggested potential deaths in the millions if Soviet forces captured them. The numbers were cold, clinical, and undeniable. They transformed surrender from military formality into mathematical survival calculation. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic assessment, captured after Germany's surrender, contained a single underlined directive: maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This wasn't defeatism but recognition of fundamental reality. Every Wehrmacht commander with functioning intelligence capabilities understood that military victory was impossible. The only remaining objective was ensuring maximum survival of forces and civilians under their protection. The question wasn't whether to surrender, but to whom. American forces holding the western bank of the Elbe possessed logistical capacity that would prove crucial in processing the coming surge. Each infantry division had attached military police battalions, field kitchens capable of feeding 15,000 men daily, mobile medical units with surgical capabilities, and vast supply stockpiles reflecting American industrial capacity. Major James Morrison, operations officer for the 102nd Infantry Division, studied mass surrender logistics after the Ruhr Pocket operation in mid-April, where 325,000 Germans had surrendered. His calculations were sobering. Processing 1,000 prisoners required 3 tons of food daily, 5,000 gallons of water, medical screening for typhus and dysentery, delousing stations, and administrative documentation generating 12 forms per individual. Geneva Convention mandated specific caloric intakes, 2,800 calories for working prisoners, 2,000 for non-working. These weren't just numbers but the difference between order and chaos when handling desperate humanity. April 20th. Wenk receives Hitler's order to attack toward Berlin. He requests time to coordinate with neighboring units. 24 hours granted. Wenk immediately convenes his senior commanders at headquarters near Belzig. The meeting is brief. His intelligence officer, Colonel Gunther Reich, presents the tactical situation. Berlin is surrounded by 2 Soviet army groups totaling 40 divisions. Wenk's 12th Army consists of roughly 100,000 men, many teenage conscripts from training schools or elderly Volkssturm members. Operational armor, 12 Tiger tanks, 34 Panthers. Ammunition sufficient for perhaps 48 hours of sustained combat. Artillery support limited by fuel shortages. The proposed attack route crosses 60 kilometers of Soviet-controlled territory against forces that outnumber them 20-1. Reich concludes his briefing with casualty projections. Attempting the attack, estimated 90% casualties within 72 hours, with negligible chance of reaching Berlin. Even if successful, Berlin itself cannot be held. Alternative proposal, use 12th Army to establish and hold an escape corridor from the Elbe River eastward, allowing trapped Wehrmacht forces and civilian refugees to reach American lines. Estimated casualties, 40% over 2 weeks, but saving hundreds of thousands of lives otherwise doomed to Soviet capture. Wenk studies the maps for long minutes. His officers wait in silence. Finally, he speaks. Comrades, the war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology but to the living, our soldiers and the civilians depending on us. We attack, but westward to open a path to the Americans. This isn't cowardice but calculated humanity. We will hold this corridor until every soul who can reach it crosses to American lines. Officers are dismissed to prepare operations. Wenk sits alone with the maps, understanding he has just committed treason and saved thousands in the same decision. By April 24, forward American observation posts report extraordinary scenes. German vehicles approach the Elbe without tactical spacing, headlights blazing in violation of basic combat principles. Wehrmacht units arrive in parade formation, officers maintaining military bearing even in defeat. These aren't beaten rabbles but organized forces choosing captivity over continued resistance. Captain Robert Thornton, commanding a reconnaissance company of the 2nd Armored Division, radios division headquarters. German forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They're displaying white flags and requesting terms. The first formal surrender occurs at 1400 hours. 3,000 Germans, weapons stacked, documentation prepared, requesting processing according to Geneva Convention. American forces accept. Within hours, the trickle becomes a flood. The Ruhr Pocket surrender in mid-April had established crucial precedent. When Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender, 325,000 German troops had given themselves up to American forces. Treatment they received, food, medical care, protection from revenge-seeking displaced persons, spread through Wehrmacht communication channels with extraordinary speed. Radio intercepts by American signals intelligence revealed remarkable conversations between German units. April 27, the commander of 3rd Panzer Corps transmitted, Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided, food distribution confirmed. That last point was crucial. German forces had been on starvation rations for weeks. Psychological impact was immediate and profound. But reaching American lines required surviving a deadly gauntlet. SS blocking detachments had orders to execute any soldier retreating without authorization. Military police units established checkpoints on all western roads, turning back or shooting defeatists attempting to flee. The SS remained fanatically loyal even as the Reich collapsed around them, viewing surrender as betrayal punishable by immediate execution. This created a deadly paradox. German soldiers faced probable death advancing east against Soviets, probable death retreating west through SS lines, or probable survival if they could somehow reach American positions. The desperate solution: entire units coordinated mass movements overwhelming blocking detachments through sheer numbers, or bypass checkpoints entirely through forest infiltration routes mapped by reconnaissance elements. The Battle of Elbe from April 24 to May 1 represented the bloodiest example of the flight's human cost. General Theodor Bussy's 9th Army encircled southeast of Berlin comprised 200,000 soldiers and 40,000 civilians. Hitler ordered them to attack toward Berlin and link up with the capital's defenders. Instead, Bussy coordinated covertly with Wenk to break out westward toward American lines. The breakout began at 2000 hours April 25. Leading elements of the 11th SS Panzer Corps used their last fuel reserves to punch through Soviet lines near Elbe village. Behind them came an extraordinary procession. Combat troops, medical units, administrative personnel, civilian refugees, military dependents, even regimental bands carrying their instruments. The column stretched 30 kilometers through the Spree forest, a serpentine mass of humanity stumbling through swamps and woods toward Wenk's corridor and ultimate American captivity beyond. Soviet forces reacted with overwhelming firepower. Katyusha rocket batteries fired into packed columns. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft strafed anything moving. T-34 tanks crushed defensive positions and the people manning them. The forest became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled at stream crossings where Soviet machine guns had perfect fields of fire. Wounded soldiers who couldn't keep up were abandoned where they fell, knowing what awaited them. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding remnants of a panzer regiment, later described the horror. No longer war but massacre. Soviet artillery turned forest paths into death zones. We kept moving because stopping meant certain death. I saw officers shoot their own wounded rather than leave them for Soviet capture. The statistics were catastrophic. Of 200,000 who began the breakout, approximately 40,000 reached Wenk's lines and eventual American captivity. The Elbe Forest Cemetery today contains 24,000 graves, most marked unknown German soldier. Another 60,000 were captured by Soviet forces, few of whom would survive captivity. The remainder simply vanished, killed in unnamed skirmishes, drowned attempting river crossings, or lost in the forest's depths. Yet even this horrific casualty rate validated the desperate flight's logic. Those 40,000 who reached American lines had a 96% survival probability. Those 60,000 captured by Soviets faced 65% mortality in camps. The 40,000 who escaped represented 40,000 futures, families, lives continuing beyond war's end. Wenk's 12th Army performed one of the war's most remarkable humanitarian operations. Defying Hitler's direct orders to attack toward Berlin, Wenk instead established a 40-kilometer corridor from the Elbe River to the scattered remnants of German forces trapped to the east. His 100,000 troops, including the elite Clausewitz and Scharnhorst panzer divisions, held this passage against Soviet pressure while refugees streamed through. Wenk established headquarters in a schoolhouse near Fürth, transforming it into a coordination center for the evacuation. His staff worked continuously, organizing transportation for wounded, distributing the army's last food supplies to civilians, and maintaining radio contact with scattered German units still fighting westward. Lieutenant Hans Maymann, serving in Wenk's operations section, recorded the magnitude of their task. We estimate 500,000 civilians in our sector plus remnants of 20 different military units. No food for civilians, medical supplies exhausted, ammunition sufficient for perhaps 48 hours of combat. Yet we must hold until all who can be saved reach American lines. Wenk personally visited forward positions, encouraging exhausted soldiers to hold their ground just a few more days. To his men, many teenagers from training schools or elderly Volkssturm, he became a figure of almost mythical determination. He could have fled, one soldier later recalled. Senior officers were disappearing daily, heading west in staff cars. But Wenk stayed, and because he stayed, we stayed. The general's tactical brilliance showed in his defensive positioning. Rather than attempting to hold continuous lines, he established strong points at key road junctions and river crossings, forcing Soviet units to deploy for formal attacks rather than simply pursuing. This bought precious time for refugee columns, though at terrible cost to defending units. Each strong point was expected to hold until overrun or ammunition exhausted, then withdraw to secondary positions closer to the Elbe. It was calculated sacrifice. Hold 12 hours here, save 3,000 refugees there. The mathematics of mercy written in blood and time. The damaged Tangamunda Bridge became the focal point of the evacuation. Wehrmacht engineers had demolished the modern structure April 12 to slow American advance, but ironically its twisted remains now served as the only crossing point for 50 kilometers in either direction. German military engineers and American combat engineers worked from opposite banks to shore up the wreckage, creating a precarious single-file pathway across the river. The scenes at the crossing defied military precedent. From May 4 to May 7, an estimated 100,000 people crossed the broken structure. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic alongside American sergeants. German military police maintained order on the eastern approach while American MPs controlled the western bank. Both sides understood that chaos meant disaster. If the crossing became blocked, thousands would be trapped as Soviet forces approached. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 102nd Infantry Division described the surreal cooperation. German officers saluted us. We saluted back. Their engineers asked our engineers for equipment to strengthen the bridge. We gave it to them. Everyone understood lives depended on keeping that crossing open. The human stream was endless and heartbreaking. A Wehrmacht colonel arrived with complete regimental staff and insisted on formally surrendering his unit's battle flag. An SS general appeared in full dress uniform, requesting honorable captivity for his men. A naval captain led 200 Kriegsmarine sailors who hadn't seen the ocean in months, having been pressed into ground combat. Female auxiliary personnel, some as young as 17, begged American soldiers not to send them back east. Most poignant were the civilians. Families pushed belongings in baby carriages and wheelbarrows. Children separated from parents in chaos were passed hand to hand across the bridge. Elderly people who could barely walk were carried by strangers. Hospital patients, some still in beds, were wheeled across by medical staff who refused to abandon them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, supervising the western approach, later wrote, "They came in waves, dawn to dusk, then through the night by moonlight." Soldiers still carrying weapons they'd stack in piles like cordwood. Women with babies. Kids who looked like they should be in grammar school but wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. Old men in Volkssturm armbands. Nobody ran. Nobody resisted. They were just grateful to reach our side. The sheer scale overwhelmed American administrative capacity. Geneva Convention requirements mandated specific documentation for each prisoner, medical screening, and provision of adequate food and shelter. Processing one prisoner properly required 20 minutes. At peak flow, 20,000 were arriving daily. The system simply collapsed under the weight of numbers. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff for the 18th Airborne Corps, made a crucial decision. Forget the paperwork. Get them fed. Get them deloused. Get medical attention to the wounded. Documentation can wait. Lives can't. This pragmatic approach saved thousands but created administrative chaos lasting years. Families were separated in confusion, some never to reunite. Soldiers were separated from units, making accurate casualty counts impossible. But the alternative, turning people away, was unthinkable. The medical crisis was acute. Army medical units estimated 30% of surrendering Germans required immediate attention. Malnutrition was universal after months on starvation rations. Typhus spread by lice threatened epidemic proportions. Combat wounds untreated for weeks had become gangrenous. Battlefield surgery units designed to treat dozens were handling hundreds daily. Captain David Miller, medical officer with the 330th Medical Battalion, performed surgery for 72 straight hours. These weren't fresh combat wounds. These were weeks old, infected, untreated. Men had been walking on broken bones, fighting with shrapnel still embedded. Women auxiliaries with untreated injuries from assault. Children with malnutrition so severe they couldn't stand. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible dilemma. Yalta agreements were explicit. German forces must surrender to all Allies simultaneously. Separate surrenders to Western forces while continuing to fight Soviets violated inter-Allied agreements and threatened the post-war alliance before it even began. Yet the humanitarian catastrophe was undeniable. On May 4, Admiral Karl Donitz, who had succeeded Hitler as head of state, sent Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg to negotiate with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Friedberg's proposal was frank. Immediate surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and Holland to Western Allies, allowing maximum evacuation from the east before Soviet arrival. Montgomery, bound by Allied agreements, could only accept unconditional surrender to all Allies simultaneously. But he also understood the human dimension. In his memoirs, he later wrote, "The Germans weren't just seeking military surrender. They were seeking salvation from Soviet retribution. As soldiers, we could offer honorable captivity. What the Russians offered after 27 million Soviet deaths, only God knew. The temporary solution was pragmatic if ethically ambiguous." German forces reaching American lines before formal surrender on May 8 would be processed as prisoners. Those arriving after would be subject to repatriation agreements with Soviets. This created a deadly deadline. Cross the Elbe before midnight May 8 or face Soviet captivity with all that implied. 0241 hours, May 7. General Alfred Jodl signs Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. The ceasefire will take effect at 2301 hours May 8. This gives German forces exactly 45 hours to reach American lines. The greatest race against time in military history has begun. Intelligence estimates 250,000 German military personnel remain east of the Elbe on May 7. Within 45 hours, approximately 180,000 will successfully reach American lines. The others will enter Soviet captivity with terrible consequences. Wenk's final operation exemplifies military honor in defeat. His 12th Army holds its corridor until the last possible moment, allowing remnants of the 9th Army and hundreds of thousands of civilians to escape. Wenk positions his last operational tanks and artillery to hold Soviet forces while the exodus continues. At 1800 hours May 7, Wenk issues his final order. The 12th Army has fulfilled its last duty. We have saved all we could save. Every commander is now free to seek safety for his men. It is not a surrender but a release from duty, allowing his soldiers to make their own choices about survival and capture. Wenk himself is among the last to cross at 0200 hours May 8, walking across a damaged railroad bridge near Tangamunda less than 21 hours before the ceasefire. Behind him, Soviet tanks are already entering positions his men abandoned hours earlier. Of his original 200,000 men, approximately 100,000 reach American lines. An estimated 250,000 civilians are saved by his defiance of Hitler's orders. The cost is terrible. His rearguard units suffer 80% casualties holding the corridor's final hours. But the mathematics of mercy validate every sacrifice. Each hour purchased saves thousands of lives that would otherwise end in Soviet camps. Individual stories reveal the depth of desperation. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann flies his Messerschmitt Bf 109 West until fuel runs out, crash landing in an American-occupied field rather than risk Soviet territory. U-boat commander Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock sails his submarine up the Elbe as far as possible, then scuttles it and leads his crew overland to American lines. A Wehrmacht doctor stays with severely wounded patients who cannot be moved, knowing it means Soviet captivity, saying only, "Someone must care for those who cannot flee." A teenage soldier gives his place on an overcrowded truck to an elderly civilian, then begins walking the 100 kilometers to American lines. He arrives 18 hours after the ceasefire, technically too late, but is accepted by sympathetic American guards who understand what the delay cost him. 22:47 hours, May 8. 63-year-old Heinrich Fischer stumbles onto the western bank of the Elbe. 14 minutes before the ceasefire. He collapses on American-occupied ground, lungs burning, legs unable to support him. An American medic rushes over. "You made it," the medic says, offering water. Fischer, gasping, manages one phrase through tears. "I wanted to see my grandchildren again." He did. The ceasefire takes effect 14 minutes later. Behind Fischer, Soviet forces establish positions on the eastern bank. Those still trying to cross are turned back. Their fate is sealed by 14 minutes and 200 meters of river. The Rhine meadow camps become collection points for this human flood. These temporary enclosures, often just agricultural fields surrounded by barbed wire, hold over 1 million German prisoners by May 15. Conditions are harsh but survivable, the crucial difference from Soviet camps. Prisoners initially have no shelter except holes dug in ground. Food is basic, 1,200 calories daily initially, increased as supplies improve. Water comes from rivers and temporary pipes. Sanitation is primitive. Disease spreads quickly in overcrowded conditions. Yet the death rate remains below 1% compared to 35% or higher in Soviet camps. The difference isn't comfort but intent. American institutional culture follows Geneva Convention because military professionalism demands it. Soviet culture, after 27 million deaths, operates under different mathematics. What German forces fled becomes clear as Soviet-occupied territories reveal their grim reality. NKVD documents declassified after 1991 confirmed German fears were justified. Of approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by Soviet forces, at least 1.1 million die in captivity. Death rate in 1945 to 1946 exceeds 50% in many camps. Causes are multiple and interconnected. Soviet logistics can barely supply their own forces, let alone millions of prisoners. German prisoners receive 600 to 800 calories daily, far below survival requirements for forced labor. Medical care is virtually non-existent. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Siberian winter temperatures drop to -40 Celsius without adequate clothing or shelter. Beyond material deprivation is systematic brutality. Soviet guards, many having lost families to German atrocities, show little mercy. The statistics tell the entire story. American records show that of 3.8 million German prisoners in Western custody, approximately 137,000 die, a death rate of 3.6%. Most deaths occur from wounds received before capture or disease in the war's chaotic final weeks. By June 1945, death rate in American camps has stabilized at 0.15% monthly. Soviet records, even official ones, reveal catastrophe. Soviet figures acknowledge 356,700 German prisoner deaths, but German research indicates the true number exceeds 1 million. The Maschke Commission documents that of prisoners taken in 1945, fewer than 50% survived to 1950. The differential is starker for specific groups. Waffen-SS members have a 20% survival rate in Soviet camps versus 95% in American custody. General Walter Wenk survives the war, living until 1982. In a 1975 interview, he reflects on those desperate days. I disobeyed Hitler's orders and would do so again. My duty wasn't to a dead ideology but to living men under my command. Every soldier we got across the Elbe was a victory. Every civilian saved was a triumph. We lost the war, but in those last days we saved what could be saved, human lives. Wenk never expresses regret for his defiance. Hitler ordered us to sacrifice ourselves for his Götterdämmerung fantasy. I chose instead to save my men for their families, for Germany's future. Between honor and humanity, I chose humanity. History can judge whether I was right. His actions save an estimated 250,000 soldiers and civilians from Soviet captivity. Many survivors and their descendants still gather annually on May 8 to honor Wenk's memory, calling him the general who chose life over death, mercy over ideology. The mass German surrender to American forces in April-May 1945 represents more than military capitulation. It is a massive humanitarian crisis, an ideological collapse, and ultimately a testament to mercy's power in